Welcome to Pop Culture Paradox. On this episode, we watch the full-length interview with David Alexander, the author of Star Trek Creator, as we look back on the saga of the Star Trek television series.
Our guest for this program is the author of Star Trek Creator, the official, authorized, definitive biography of Gene Roddenberry, the man who is responsible for the television show Star Trek. The writer of this book is David Alexander. And David, I'd like to start out by asking a question concerning this book, actually more toward the writing of this book. For instance, many writers, when they are approaching a subject, particularly somebody who has been an icon for many people for many years, find themselves having to talk to members of the family, having to beat the doors down to talk to friends who knew this particular person, going into the libraries. But you had an advantage because Gene Roddenberry, while he was alive, specifically targeted you and made you his official biographer. And you knew him, so that kind of gave you almost an advantage over other writers in approaching the subject of Gene Roddenberry, Star Trek Creator. I was wondering if you could tell me when you first met Gene Roddenberry.
Well, I first met Gene back in 1976 at a Star Trek convention, the only one I'd ever gone to, over at the Los Angeles Airport Marriott Hotel. I was kind of curious. I wasn't a Trekkie, and now known as Trekkers. I just walked in, looked around, and there was the big guy. I recognized him, walked over and said, can I buy you a drink? Introduced myself. He says, sure. We had a talk. We talked for 20 minutes or so. No one bothered us. He was quite approachable, affable, friendly. Star Trek was just beginning its climb into international status at that time. Got along well with him, thanked him for an interesting conversation, and left. I ran into him again in early 1990 down in Florida at a humanist conference that I was at, where I was being named editor of a magazine, and he walked right in front of me at the conference, and I, Gene, hey! Reintroduced myself to him, told him where we had met, and he very kindly said, I think I remember that. I did not believe that he could at that point. I just thought he was being nice, but later on in my research, I came to the conclusion that he probably did remember. He had one of those strange trick memories that could remember everything that he saw or heard or read. I asked him for an interview for the magazine, and he said, well, who'll do it? And I said, me. And he said, fine. And we just went forward from there. We became friends over the course of the 6 months that I took to do the interview. We have similar philosophical backgrounds. He trusted me, and trusted me to tell his story accurately and without sensation, and I believe I have.
Yes. Like I said, this is the kind of book that if a college student were going to do a report about Gene Roddenberry or the Star Trek phenomena, this is the book that they would want to read.
Thank you. It has the only real accurate story of the development of Star Trek, where Gene's ideas came from, how some of the characters were developed, the casting, and the chronology for getting it on the air.
One of the things that you mentioned that I found to be quite interesting, and I later learned about this in reading an interview that you did with Gene Roddenberry, is you mentioned that you saw him at a humanist convention, and Gene Roddenberry was pretty much a Democrat most of his life, correct?
Yes, both Big D and Little D. His father was born about 30 years after the end of the Civil War down in Folkston, Georgia, and had a lifelong detestation of Republicans. It was a vile epithet never to be used in his home. He had just an absolute hatred of those people, and while Gene didn't carry over the hatred, he carried over the kind of general distrust of Republicans and big business. And much of Gene's life was an artistic expression against overt authority and big business.
Well, now that's interesting. In looking at the stories of Gene's father back in the days of the Depression, I'm getting the feeling of a man who, I don't know if lifting himself up by his own bootstraps would necessarily be a good word for it, but we're talking about a man who was on the police force The LAPD, correct?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct. His father was a Los Angeles policeman.
And he did...
And a rare thing in those days because he was an honest cop. This was in the days when the LA Police Department, you could buy the civil service exam answers for $50, and you could buy a captaincy for $250. And if you were on the intelligence squads or the vice squads, it was a license to steal. And virtually everyone who was on those squads did. Gene's dad was a straightforward patrolman, was a patrolman for 20 years, did various things during his time on the LAPD, but pretty much kept his nose clean.
That's a lot of people probably maybe gave kind of a mild chuckle there when you said that was back during the days when there was corruption going on in the LAPD.
Well, you cannot have a police force made up of human beings without having some corruption, and the odd cop that does the wrong thing. But for the most part today, the police forces that we have today are choir boys in comparison to the cops that they used to have. Policemen who were literally in the pay of the bad guys. You don't see that so much today.
Gene's father, though, did manage to keep his family above water during the Depression when his neighbors were not doing too hot financially, and they would come over to the Roddenberry's house to have dinner or whatever, and he would try to help out his neighbors as much as possible.
Yes, Gene's dad, Eugene Edward Roddenberry, was the archetypal strong man in Gene's life, and it was from him that he learned strength of character, I think, and his father's better qualities. Now, you understand, coming from the South and the period of time that his father was raised, his dad was a raving bigot. African Americans were niggers and Jews were kikes and were regularly referenced as such in the Roddenberry home. Interestingly, Gene did not pick up on any of that, didn't adopt any of that attitude, and I think that much of the Star Trek philosophy that he developed later in life was in reaction to his father's prejudices.
I'm wondering, when did he start having any questioning towards his father's prejudices? Most people who grow up in that kind of an environment just subconsciously adopt the prejudices. They don't even think about it.
Gene. Gene was always a very self-assured little boy. He was his own person even very early on. His classmates in junior and senior high school would describe him to me as kind of separate and apart and always observing what was going on. Gene would always question authority and would run whatever was told to him by an authority figure through either his own intelligence filter or through his own web of experience. And if it didn't jibe with what he had been told or what he knew by his own intelligence or his own series of experiences, he basically would either put it aside and reconsider it later or would ignore it.
Well, tell me about when Gene became, and I'm going to say this even though it kind of contradicts what you said here, but when did Gene start to become his own person? Obviously he was his own person while he was still living under his father's house, but I'm wondering if you could probably tell us about when Gene left home to basically establish his own identity. What was that like? What kind of circumstances did he find himself in?
Well, he essentially marked that at about 16 or so, when he was coming into his own as a personality. And when he essentially rejected his mother's religion. His mother was a good Baptist right out of the South from El Paso. And it was about 16 or so when, as he told me, he actually started listening to the sermons that were being preached and thought that it was crazy, magical superstition and nonsense. And that was at about the time he stopped going to church. He left home at about the age of 19 or 20 to go off to the war. He had joined the Army Air Force in July of 1941, and then when the Japanese visited Pearl Harbor on December 7th, he got his call 11 days later, and he was off to Kelly Field in Texas for advanced pilot training. He already was a pilot. He had gotten his wings when he was a student at Los Angeles City College, in the civilian pilot training program there.
So When he was in the Air Force, I have to ask this, when he was on the Air Force, did he spend any time on the USS Enterprise?
The Enterprise was the flagship of, was it, I think it was Admiral Halsey at the time, and it did come into the bay where Gene was stationed in Fiji. And whether he actually got on the ship or not, I do not know. He did later in life spend time on one of the aircraft carriers, I believe. I think it was either the Kennedy or the Enterprise, one of the nuclear aircraft carriers. I don't remember precisely which one, but he spent a week on that well after Star Trek and fame.
So, okay, we have a man who's coming out where his father is a LAPD patrolman, and then he goes into the military. Where did this interest in television come from?
Well, Gene wanted to be a writer. And had wanted to be a writer since his teenage days, but making a living as a writer, actually he wanted to be a poet, but making a living as a poet was a very haphazard arrangement. He had been married, he had a child, and this is about 1948, 1949, 48 actually, and he saw a television set at a neighbor's back in New York when he was living in New York flying for Pan American. And he thought that that was going to be the wave of the future. A little movie screen, entertainment in everyone's home. He thought that that would be the wave of the future, and ultimately quit Pan Am and moved to California, where he thought, since the movie production was situated out here, that's where television production would be. Unfortunately, he was wrong. Mostly television production at that time was in New York. And so he stayed out here and got a job as, ironically enough, a policeman.
But I'm trying to get to that gap from being a policeman into going into the TV industry. I mean, this was not at the time when you could just go to, say, USC and just have a nice full-blown film program like you have today.
No, that's true. One of the things that I did in the book was to detail how Gene taught himself to write. As you say, there were no extension classes, there were no books, there were books on how to write plays. I think the Art of Dramatic Writing by Egris existed, and a few others, but there was nothing on how to write for television. What you have in the early days of television in the 1950s is a situation that is perfectly analogous to the pulp magazine days of the 20s and 30s. A lot of terrific writers learned to write for the pulps. Ray Bradbury, Asimov, Earl Stanley Gardner, perhaps the greatest example that most of your audience would recognize today. They would write and write and write thousands and thousands of words. Their editors would tell them what they would want, and essentially through feedback, they would learn what the editors would want and what the public would accept. Well, in early television just had hundreds of half-hour anthology programs doing what were essentially short stories on television. And this became a very definite form that you had to write within a certain format. You had to write for 2 characters or 4 characters or whatever it was. You had to write fairly quickly if you were going to make a living at it. And you had to write reasonably well. Gene learned how to do that. He learned how to write quickly, he learned how to write well, and developed his skills. He was working for the Public Information Division of the Los Angeles Police Department when Fred Ziv, Z-I-V, the early television pioneer, radio pioneer, and then he became a television pioneer, called and asked for a technical advisor for his program, Mr. District Attorney. Captain Stanley Sheldon, who was Gene's boss, sent Gene over. I found Fred Ziv. He's 89 years old now, I think it is, and great raconteur. Told me this terrific story about this large policeman, Gene was almost 6'3", at the Ziv studios for several days, uniform, badge, gun, whistle, everything, reading over scripts, and then saying to their story editor, John Epstein, well, I can write stuff as good as this. And at that point he was invited, well, if you're so good, why don't you show us something? He did. They liked it. They bought it. In fact, I reproduced the original story outline, the original pitch letter that Gene sent them. It sold, and he got $700 for something that took about a week or so to write. And at that time, Gene was making just over $400 as a policeman for a month's pay. So this was exciting. This was a lot of money. And so he kept working and kept working to the point where he became quite good at it and ultimately had to quit the LAPD.
Well, yeah. I was about to say I was on the verge of coming out with that. That's pretty risky because while $700 may be a lot back during the 50s, to keep up that momentum, to always be writing stories, to always be writing scripts that consistently sell, that would be a gamble. And he just kept it. He just kept his day job for a while until he was just confident. He just kept selling the stories.
Well, he had a couple of things. Number one, when he resigned from the LAPD in '56, I think it was June 7th, he was already pretty well rolling along with Ziv. He was the head writer for the program West Point Story. In fact, early on that year, I found that Ziv wanted to fly him to New York to visit the point, and he still had that pesky job at the LAPD to go to every day. So he went in, and he had plenty of accumulated off time, and he just said, well, I'll be gone for about a week and a half, 2 weeks. And they went, okay, fine. And so he went to New York. So he had this extra job that was paying. He was probably making, at that time, he was probably pulling in as much as a captain was. He knew that they needed him very much on the police department, so he could pretty well set whatever he wanted to do. Ultimately, there was too much money, there were too many demands on his time, but when he quit, he had a 3-year net. That meaning that the LAPD's policy was that for 3 years, if he decided to come back, he could have at the same rank that he left.
During his time as a writer, did he have any inkling, any idea in his mind that he would be making another leap into being a producer?
Yes, he early on decided that he wanted to be a producer because he and the family were watching Highway Patrol, the old Broderick Crawford series that Ziv produced, and he saw what a producer had done to his story, and so Gene became rather irritated and said, well, it's obvious I'm going to have to be a producer to prevent someone else rewriting my material, which of course Gene was famous for in later years, especially on Star Trek, rewriting other writers' material.
Well, that kind of goes without saying. That's a TV business.
Yes.
That's just it in general. It's a collaborative effort, and it's a miracle if a writer is ever able to get anything on TV that remotely resembles the original material.
Well, understand that film is a director's medium. Television is a producer's medium. Writers come and go, directors come and go, but it's the job of the producer or the creator-producer or the creator-writer-producer to maintain a continuity of the stories and the characters, and that's what Gene did in Star Trek.
So we're talking about a time when, I'm kind of losing track of the years here, but we're talking about a time, I Love Lucy, Your Show of Shows, The Highwaymen, Westerns.
Late 1950s.
Late 50s, and he comes up with an idea about making a science fiction program. What obstacles did he find in trying to pitch that idea?
Well, at that time, he was working for MGM. Actually, he was working for Arena Productions, the people that later did The Man from U.N.C.L.E. He was doing The Lieutenant. He had created and produced The Lieutenant for Arena Productions at MGM. And he had this idea for a television show that was science fiction. Actually, it was human drama in a science fiction setting. He took it over to MGM, and they said, we don't think we can do it. See, up to that point, science fiction on television had either been kiddie dramas like Space Patrol and Tom Corbett's Space Cadet and Captain Video and that sort of thing, or it had been anthology programs that were often more fantasy than science fiction, such as The Twilight Zone or The Outer Limits. The question that everyone had was, could you do a weekly series, hour-long series, with continuing characters, with the needed production values, the opticals, the costumes, and the quality stories, could you do all of that on a weekly basis for a reasonable amount of money? MGM decided that no, they couldn't, and what was it? I think it was Alan Simpson wrote Gene a very funny memo. He said, I'm very sorry to see you leaving the studio. He was going over to Desi Lou at the time. I'm sorry to see you go. I know you're going to be successful. It's kind of like a man watching his mother-in-law drive off a cliff in his new Cadillac convertible.
Star Trek, when do we get into that?
Well, Star Trek came along in the early 60s, and it was an amalgamation of a lot of different things. Gene had done a pilot at Screen Gems called APO 923, where he had 3 officer characters. One was kind of the emotional one was the smart one, the less emotional one, and then there was a kind of a central character of the captain around which things revolved. He created a program that never went anywhere. It never got beyond the concept stage of an ocean liner that had various story settings, stories set on the ocean liner, the captain and the first mate and the purser and all. This is 20 years before Love Boat. But out of that, he took the idea that the ship itself would be a character. He had an idea of a dirigible set in the 1890s, going around the world with a multi-ethnic crew doing feats of daring do and righting wrongs. So he kind of put all of these disparate things together and put it and called it Star Trek, and worked out the details over a period of time.
And is this one of these legends that grow out from the telling, or is there really truth in the story that when Star Trek first aired, Gene's father went from neighbors to neighbors apologizing for what his son had done?
Well, the family of which I'm quite friendly with, especially his mother, who lets me call her Nana. She's 90 years old and is just a hoot. They didn't much care for science fiction. They liked shoot-'em-ups, they liked westerns, they liked action. And Gene's dad, yes, he used to tell that story, that his father says, well, we're going to be getting him back to writing real television, and by real television, the old man meant westerns.
We're down to our last 4 minutes here, but I want to get into some of the themes that made their way onto Star Trek, that made some sponsors nervous, as well as maybe even made just the general American public nervous. And I was wondering if maybe you could talk about some of those. I know that many episodes of Star Trek, a few of them got into the subject of religion. Did Gene Roddenberry ever experience any flack for some of those episodes?
Well, always you're going to get letters. Interestingly enough, I found that Trek is something of a Rorschach test for the people watching it. When it was originally on the air, this most humanistic of television programs, written by a man who identified himself as a humanist, who would be the first to tell you that he did not did not buy into the Christian mythos. That show was written up in a 5-part series in the Salvation Army magazine, extolling its Christian virtues and its Christian principles. There was the equality of men and women on the program, or pretty much the equality of men and women, even though the women on the ship walked around in go-go boots and little short skirts. This was the 60s, after all. There was the equality between the races. The television's first interracial kiss was on Plato's Stepchildren in the 3rd season. Interestingly enough, while people made a bit of a fuss about Uhura and Captain Kirk kissing, no one said anything about Mr. Spock and Nurse Chapel kissing, and that was television's first interspecies kiss.
Well, people probably don't care about that kind of stuff, about something happening with the alien worlds, because I don't know that the general public, and I'm not even going to put that at the time, I'm not even going to put down the time period that Star Trek was being aired at, but there was something volatile at the time about a white man kissing an African American woman, because this was the height of the civil rights movement.
But it was okay for a light green guy with pointed ears to kiss this white woman on television, which the ultimate irony is no one paid any attention to that. A guy that looked like Satan is going after this typical blonde beach bunny, and no one cared.
Now, when it was pulled off the air, the uproar that occurred between the fans writing letters and trying to get the show back, was that just a spontaneous outpouring, or who was the creative force behind all of that to get everybody together to protest the show being taken off the air?
Well, there were two protests. There was a protest between the first and second season that was ostensibly led by a writer named Harlan Ellison and a number of other writers. But the truth of the matter was, as I found in the archives, Gene was behind that. Gene was the gray eminence hiding in the background pulling the strings. Between the second and third season, there was a fairly good chance that the program would be canceled. And at that point, there was a protest by students from Caltech that essentially Gene orchestrated behind the scenes. There was a young woman named Wanda Kendall who was secretly flown to New York by Gene, and she snuck into the executive parking lot and stuck Mr. Spock for President bumper stickers on all of the executives' vehicles. And then there was a fan-based movement that Gene helped out a little bit financially and organizationally a little bit, but it was principally done by B. Joe and John Trimble, who were very large fans of the program. And they, as best we've been able to determine, because NBC has never admitted how many letters have come in, but as best we can determine, it was around a little over 1 million letters were received to save Star Trek between the second and third seasons.
And while it wasn't successful in getting Star Trek back...
Well, no, it was.
Wait a minute.
It was. This was between the second and third season. There was another letter writing campaign, but it lacked the vigor of the second campaign, and it didn't come back. When NBC canceled it, it was gone.
So, okay, again...
And it stayed gone.
How many seasons did Star Trek run collectively? Three seasons, and it sounds now like at the end of each season there was always a danger of imminent cancellation here.
Oh yes, well, the sad thing was that Star Trek was never terribly successful in the general ratings. I think it never got any higher than 52. It was certainly never in the top 25 for the 3 years that it was on the air. But unfortunately, in those days, they were counting everyone that watched the program, retired firemen's widows, as Gene used to like to characterize them, and everyone else. About a year or so after it had been canceled, and there was no hope of bringing the show back at that point, Gene was told by one of the vice presidents that they had learned through refined demographic studies that they had kicked off the air their most successful program, that for the males 18 to 49, who were the principal people who bought things, they were the biggest watchers of Star Trek. And it hit a very strong target market, and NBC, not knowing any better, helped kill it and get it off the air.
But between that time and the time that the first Star Trek movie came out, we have this image of Gene Roddenberry trying, and I don't know if fail would be the right word, but trying a variety of different television productions until he eventually starts to make a tour of college circuits.
Well, what had happened there was the show went into a kind of a ratings, not ratings, but a syndication heaven. It was this giant money-making machine for Paramount, which owned Desilu at that point. And anything that would be done to produce more shows always was looked upon with great suspicion by Paramount, because they called the series their 79 crown jewels. As I said, it was this giant money-making machine that they didn't have to pay production costs. They didn't have to pay those pesky actors and writers. The program just went out and it made money and made money and made money. And they didn't have ongoing costs. So Paramount was very reluctant to do anything new. NBC started talking about bringing the show back in the early 70s. And Paramount said, fine, you'll have to order 4 episodes, and they're $750,000, et cetera, et cetera. It was a huge capital risk that NBC wasn't willing to take. So it languished.
So it languished, and I'm wondering, you mentioned how it was a money-making machine because they didn't have to pay the actors or the production costs because that had already been taken care of. I'm wondering what the financial ramifications of this were for the actors as well as for the producer of Star Trek. Did they get any residuals from these?
Well, they got the residuals depending upon their contract. Most of them were contracted for a union scale, which gave them union scale up to 5 runs. And thank you very much. I remember Nichols casually mentioning to me that everyone was paid off within 2 years. Gene received his residuals for 2 years. Now, he was a participant in the net profit distributions of Star Trek, as was NBC, interestingly enough, and Paramount. And so was Bill Shatner, surprisingly enough. Bill Shatner was to receive, by contract, 20% of the net. That got cut in half when he got divorced in 1968 or 1969. That was a community property that was divided in half. But the show didn't go into profit, or did not go where few shows have gone before, until 1984. Gene used to say that the best science fiction in television was always written by the accountants at Paramount.
And 1984, that was when Star Trek: The Next Generation premiered.
No, that was 1987. 1984, there had been 3 films, and Gene got together with Shatner and gave Paramount 4 magic words that caused them to cough up some money, and those were Burt Fields, who was a very, very powerful show business attorney in Los Angeles, and independent audit. And whoa, my goodness, Mr. Roddenberry, we're so glad you called, because we've just gone into net. And Gene got a check for $851,000.
My understanding that without the success of Star Wars, there wouldn't have been a Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Yes, it was Star Trek, and Star Wars, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. At that time, 1977, 78, they were going to redo Star Trek as a series. By then they'd finally decided, and I detail all of this. It's very confusing. It was going to be a low-budget film, then it was going to be a TV series, and then it was going to be a series of made-for-television movies, and it was going to be a television series again, and who the hell knew what was going on? Every time the guys at the hierarchy at Paramount changed their underwear, they changed their minds about what to do with Star Trek. Finally, they were going to do a made-for-television movie. It was going to be a made-for-television movie. And 10 days before the show the film is to be shot, the apocryphal, or perhaps true story, I've never been able to determine which, Charlie Bluedhorn, who owned Gulf and Western, who owned Paramount, was looking out the window of his office building in New York, saw the the block-long lines of people waiting to get in to see Star Wars, which was a little movie made with essentially unknown actors for, I think, $11 million, that was doing phenomenally well. And he turned to one of his assistants and said, "Don't we own something like that?" And then the show was, the film, the made-for-television movie, was canceled, and Robert Wise was brought in to direct, and it was going to be a big deal and a big, full-blown theatrical feature.
And did it achieve their expectations?
The road to bringing Star Trek as a feature film was as convoluted as bringing it back in the first place. One of the problems was Robert Wise had never seen Star Trek, and so Gene had to screen episodes of the show for him. to which, after making hundreds of millions of dollars, the wonderful folks at Paramount said, well, Gene, we're only going to charge you $150 an episode to show this to Robert Wise. The sad thing about the film, they were two very, very sad things. Number one, or several sad things. The studio insisted that they have experienced film writers write it, so Gene did not write it. They decided that they were going to use Robert Abel and Associates to do the special effects, and no one bothered to check out what their delivery history had been like, and it was abominable. Paramount guaranteed a Christmas premiere and took $20 million in deposits. So when Robert Abel was not able to deliver the special effects, they had special effects houses all over the world working on double, triple, and quadruple golden overtime to bring out these special effects so that they could cobble something together and call it a motion picture. There was no producer look at. Gene didn't see it until the premiere because Wise worked on it until the day before. He had to fly to Washington with a wet print. There were no audience testings, as is usually the case. It was a mess, and it just didn't come across the way they wanted it to. And the final insult was when Paramount took all the money spent on the 5 or 6 or 8 years of development before and dumped it all into the budget of this film. And that's what kicked it from 20 million bucks up to 42 million, and Gene took it in the neck for that.
But the fan, I remember being in the audience when that film premiered, and even though, looking back on it, I have to agree with you that the film wasn't all that it could be. There was still such an excitement that
Yes.
these people were back.
Yes.
They're
well,
back.
Our friends were back. They were on the screen, and it was a big experience. And I still think that the Wise film is more of a film experience than the other films. The other movies may be better stories and better movies, but they're, to my way of thinking, they are basically giant television episodes as opposed to what Robert Wise did, which is a full-blown film. If you factor out the extra $22 million that they put into, that they dumped onto the budget, it's still the highest grossing film, made the most money.
And then when Star Trek The Next Generation comes along, again another gamble, because we're remanning the whole Enterprise. There's going to be a different captain, different characters, maybe a few people from the original Star Trek programs appearing to kind of...
Wasn't that necessarily a big risk? In my research, I found one of the very friendly chaps on the show, one of the actors, told me in great confidence, since I don't identify them, it's okay. All the actors had 3 contracts. There was a contract for the pilot, there was a contract for 13 weeks, and there was a contract for 6 years. So at any point along the way, Paramount could pull the plug, and they'd only be out the cost of the original pilot, or they'd only be out 13 episodes. But if it was a success, they were going to keep those people around for 6 years.
No, this next question, I can imagine that if Gene Roddenberry were here and had to answer this next question, it would almost be like a father being asked which of your children is your favorite. But I'm going to ask this question anyway. Between the original television series and the movies and Star Trek The Next Generation, what do you think pleased Gene the more?
Well, Gene was able to do, he was pleased on the original series, he was pleased on the Next Generation. He did not have that much to do with the movies. He withdrew into being an executive consultant, for which they paid him reasonably decent money and could access his opinion or pay attention to it if they wanted to. More often they didn't, and I detail a great deal of that in the book. He liked both the shows for different reasons. I mean, he was very excited one time. He told me that it was really exciting because he was sitting in Nick Adele's restaurant, which is the restaurant that used to be right next to KHJ, right outside the lot of Paramount on Melrose. And he heard people in the background talking about his show. And he said that was one of the great thrills of his life, to hear people talking about something that he created and put on television. That was exciting. He liked The Next Generation because the success of The Next Generation proved that the original series wasn't a fluke, it wasn't an accident. As he used to say, all I have to do now is go catch lightning in a bottle for the second time.
Now, has it been 2 years now since Gene Roddenberry passed on?
Creeping up on 3.
Creeping up on 2 years.
3.
3 years. What do you think his legacy is?
His legacy is not the shows. I have come to conclude his legacy is the message, and his principal legacy is the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who were strongly affected by Star Trek and his humanistic message that things will be all right in the future, we will grow up, we will learn to solve our problems, and we will learn to live with one another.
So you would say Gene Roddenberry was optimistic about our future. He wasn't necessarily a doomsayer.
Oh, no, not at all. He was a great believer in us as a successful species. He didn't say that we were going to make it tomorrow or the next day because, well, tomorrow could be 500 years long. He was absolutely convinced and had great faith in us as a species, and I think that's what people pick up on.
Very interesting to note that in the A&E special biography about Gene Roddenberry, as well as in your book, Gene Roddenberry's ashes were sent up in the space shuttle.
Yes. That started, our quest to have that done was started the next day after Gene passed away. I was with him when he died, and I was at the house the next day. His personal assistant and I, Ernie Over, were sitting in the office. The idea struck both of us at the same time. I said, I'll go drop this on Majel. I walked across the foyer into the family room, sat down where she was waiting for a phone call from Forest Lawn to tell us that they were ready to cremate the body. Before I could say anything, she just looked at me and said, gee, I just wish we could shoot his ashes into space. And I said, I'll start working on it. And got up and walked out of the room, and we made some phone calls, and about a year later, it happened.
Thank you for watching Pop Culture Paradox. And if you liked what you see, please subscribe to this channel and like this video and come back for more.